Mr. President, within a matter of days, our national debt will top $20 trillion, notching another ominous milestone in our nation's long-running addiction to spending. How did we get here? Well, a decade ago, taxpayers learned that many of their elected representatives were complicit in an insidious practice that rotted the legislative branch to its core, and that's congressional earmarking. Called a gateway drug by our distinguished former colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Tom Coburn, earmarks have long exacerbated the federal government's spending addiction. As old as the Republic, earmarks have always been used by generations of politicians as currency to curry favor with well-connected special interests. After public outrage reached a critical mass, both the House and the Senate instituted bans on earmarking, ended what had been a corrupt pay-to-play culture in Congress. In order to preserve this important check against the corrupting influence of earmarks, I recently sent a letter to President Donald Trump respectfully urging him to veto any legislation containing earmarks that reaches his desk. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Senator John McCain, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, and Ben Sasse for co-signing this letter. And Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following letter be submitted.
Without objection.
Now, to explain the urgency behind my letter to the President, I'd like to remind my colleagues in this body, many of whom were not in the Congress before enactment of the moratorium, just how bad the earmarking epidemic became. For the uninitiated, the term earmark is a euphemism for when lawmakers work to circumvent the regular, normal appropriations process in order to secure special funding for projects in their home districts or their state. Now, this resulted in federal tax dollars being doled out to members of Congress on a whim, bypassing normal, rigorous federal and public vetting. Now, instead of focusing on oversight responsibilities or devising legislative solutions for the nation's most pressing challenges, lawmakers and staffers devoted thousands of man-hours toward filling earmark requests. Congressional appropriators and appropriations committees transformed into what were termed favor factories, abandoning oversight responsibilities to focus on rationing out pork. Now, to me, that was one of the most insidious parts of the whole earmarking era. We have oversight responsibilities here in Congress, and there is a huge federal budget that we should be providing oversight on. But instead of poring over agency spending and searching for waste in our trillion-dollar discretionary budget, members and staff devoted countless hours to roughly 2 or 3% of the federal budget. There was so much focus on just doling out what represented 1 or 2 or 3% of the federal budget that we basically neglected the rest of the federal budget in terms of oversight. In less than 20 years, the number of earmarks in the transportation bill alone grew from 152 to 6,300. President Reagan, I believe in 1988, famously said that he vetoed the highway bill because he hadn't seen that much pork, he said, since he handed out ribbons at the county fair. And there were 152 earmarks in the transportation bill that year. By 2005, it was 6,300. That's an increase of more than 4,000%. Examples of earmarks range from $250 million for a bridge to nowhere in Alaska. Everybody became familiar with that one. $50 million for an indoor rainforest in Iowa, paid for by taxpayers across the country. $500,000 for a teapot museum in North Carolina. Now, all of these earmarks added up, eventually totaling about $29 billion a year. It was in this environment that, along with a small group of like-minded colleagues, I set out to put an end to this form of transactional politics that had infected the halls of Congress. Our mission was to place a permanent moratorium on congressional earmarks. It took unprecedented revelations of widespread corruption and illegality, and ultimately the jailing of lawmakers, staffers, and lobbyists before the public's outrage forced Congress to clean up its act. But even brazen instances of public corruption didn't stop Congress from dragging its feet on reforms. And the majority party, my party, paid the price at the polls in 2006. The dominant mood of the electorate at that time, that of a mistrust in government institutions, is strikingly reminiscent of the drain the swamp mentality that permeated last November's election. But despite this surging anti-insider sentiment across the ideological spectrum, there is now a chorus of lawmakers from both sides of the aisle working behind the scenes to lift the congressional earmark moratorium. These earmark defenders will trot out arguments ranging from congressional or constitutional prerogative to the insignificance of earmarks relative to the entire federal budget. It's okay to earmark, they'll say. We're only earmarking 1% of the federal budget. But all of these defenses ring hollow. The constitutional power of the purse is not a blanket mandate for Congress to spend freely. Rather, it's a fundamental duty to prevent the executive branch from wasting taxpayer dollars. By using earmarks to funnel billions of dollars to special interests, Congress ceases to be a check on the executive branch. We become no better than the free spending bureaucrats that we rail against. Now, while we were ultimately successful in securing earmark bans in both the House and the Senate, today we're seeing far too many cracks in those foundations. With so many in Congress now willing to sacrifice fiscal discipline, we have to remain vigilant against a return to business as usual. We can't afford to forfeit the hard-fought progress that we've made. Now, the Senate Republican Conference's vote earlier this year to preserve the earmark ban was an important step in the right direction, but we need to do more. That's why I sent the letter to President Trump, and it's why, should earmarks return, that I intend to challenge each one of them here on the Senate floor. Just as I did in my time in the House, I will file amendments to force debate and force votes on these earmarks. That way, members can publicly defend their earmarks to the hardworking taxpayers that they represent. Now, as we look forward to the future, I've been encouraged by the President's recognition of Washington's addiction to spending and his administration's commitment to finally doing something about it. I look forward to working with the administration to make the federal government leaner, more transparent, and more accountable to the taxpayers it serves.